So, good evening from Santiniketan. I am Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Visva-Bharati University and Senior Fellow of Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. And on behalf of the team of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, I welcome you all to this City Conversation series. India has been among the fastest growing economies in the world for close to 2 decades. With obvious implications for the pace and nature of urbanization. The combination of rising aspirations and growing middle classes on the one hand and inadequate planning on the other is creating a situation that is socially, financially and environmentally unsustainable. And one of the key underlying issues surrounding the urbanization in India is the proper management and distribution of resources, and more specifically, how people can go about their lifestyles without placing huge pressure on the natural resources and the environment in general. And also the cities are fast changing in terms of their spatial, social and economic characteristics. For example, Delhi began its post-independence life with less than 1 million inhabitants, and its antiquated urban policies, specifically bylaws, the different civic regulations and building parameters that were drawn for a city of 7,50,000 middle class residents are today out of sync for a population of 22 million, of which 80% are poor, homeless or slum inhabitants. In practice, the Indian cities are riddled with serious infrastructural deficits and basic service delivery gaps. And this not only jeopardizes the quality of life of the urban populace, but also undermines the competitive edges of these cities. And the deplorable state of these urban services is typically attributed to poor financial health and lack of planning, which are also linked to the institutional capacities or weak institutional capacities and the absence of effective governance structure in the Indian cities. And there are few ready-made models of urban governance or urban systems to be relied upon as an antidote to these urban problems. Essentially, the challenge facing India's planners and policymakers is how to radically improve the quality of life in cities so that they can continue to accommodate future growth while ensuring better living conditions for the residents and its synergic development of the rural sector. Against this backdrop, the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, along with IndraStra Global and Citymakers Mission International has launched a discussion series, the State of Cities #City Conversations. And in this talk series, we have been engaging with the experts on urban and regional studies to understand the challenges of urbanization and making the cities sustainable and inclusive. And today we are delighted to have with us Dr. Suptendu P. Biswas. Dr. Biswas is an urban theorist who works on overlapping fields of design and planning of built environment, spatial equity, landscape urbanism, urban heritage and sociocultural studies, an architect, urban designer and planning professional. He is involved in consultancy, teaching, research and writing for almost 3 decades, and his multifaceted works have been presented, published and exhibited in India and abroad. Recipient of senior fellowship from Ministry of Culture, Government of India. Biswas is one of the partners of VSPB Associates, an international award-winning architecture, urban designing and landscape firm in New Delhi. Visiting faculty member in postgraduate course at SPU New Delhi, and also one of the founders, trustee of CHURS, a Kolkata-based charitable trust working on urban sustainability and related spheres. He's a graduate from BE College, Shibpur, and he's a postgraduate and doctorate from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. And his first book, Assorted Cities, came out in 2015 and was critically acclaimed and nominated among top 5 urban writings in 2017. And he also co-edited Blue Lines of Kolkata, a book on ideas and proposals for the canals of Kolkata. And his forthcoming book on Gurgaon is expected to be released soon. Biswas is also a keen observer of politics and urbanity and its interrelationship. Today, Dr. Biswas will speak on Assorted City, a reading of contemporary Indian urbanity, and his presentation will take clues from varied research and work experiences across the realms of politics and planning, landscape urbanism, public open spaces and urban heritage to discuss the notions of assorted cities. So once again, on behalf of the team IMPRI, I welcome you, Dr. Biswas, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for such a nice introduction as well. So I will share my screen and start the presentation, and based on the presentation, then we can have discussions later. Just let me know whether you can see the screen and hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about a possible reading of contemporary Indian urbanity, and what I term is that assorted city. And as you have said, that based on certain research, especially my doctoral research, and then reading the book and also the and as well as some of the work later, where I have observed this kind of notions which is existing in Indian cities. So there are broadly 4 parts to my discussion. Some of the initial thoughts which most of us we come across in our cities. Then we discuss about politics of distribution, which is a critical notion based on which how the planning performs, and there are certain myths about the planning which can be discussed. Then we'll touch upon some of the aspects of assorted city, and then the postscripts where one can see how that can be taken forward, and I'll try to end up with some kind of a happy note and something positive. So that's how I've looked at. Now, this is part of South Delhi, in which I have marked a couple of slums and the squatters, rather squatter settlements. This is within a very posh, in some part is a very posh part of the city, Delhi, which is known to be planned part of the city. Yet we see this kind of slums happening. So this is in 2002. We can see there are a couple of slums which are here. And just one on this part, another one is this one. I hope the annotations is visible. Yes. And this the slums are actually mostly grow out of necessities by subverting planning dictum. No planning document, especially a document like Master Plan of Delhi, which has gone up to the detail of each plot and given the blueprint. So what I call it a blueprint plan. So till the point of a plot, it actually gives a land use and tries to be as meticulous as possible. Yet there are things which come out of by subverting the planning dictum, and we can see things like that. What interestingly happens is in 2003, this slum, which is even more posh area of Greater Kailash, and that gets cleared up, and where the other one, which is near Govindpuri, continues to remain till today. Even today, it is 2003, the other one gets cleaned up. And both the slums are actually, they came up at a point, at a site where there's some DDA community center or community spaces are to be designed or built. Those are the areas where it came up. So we see the selective clearing of slums in one place, and where the other one remains. And also I see the slum site in by 2014, in 10 years down the line, it becomes a community center. And there are some part which becomes a place for real estate, some offices came up and things like that. Now, if we look at this particular slum, we get into a detail of it, we see that this is a condition of what one is talking about assortment. One side is residential flats, another side is a plotted, third, this one is almost like resettlement colonies, and so it comes within that. And if we get into the details of it, we see, I mean, we started looking at it, that this slum and squatter does not have any water supply. So the tankers come in the morning and there's a huge chaos, and street gets completely jammed. And these are some of the locations in the tanker supply. What we see that at one place people struggle, they go on top of, so it's something to be seen, they go on top of the tanker and take the water and things like that, whereas in the vicinity the water flows out of somebody's water tank. So there's a complete disparity, and one at one place in just about 200 meters from one to the other, we see the abundance getting wasted. Another one, people are struggling on a daily basis to get the water. So these observations to some extent, and there are many more, this is one of that, and this is more symptomatic, and there are many more observations like that which exist across places in Delhi, Calcutta, anywhere else. I mean, it's almost like a generic kind of an observation. So what does it say? On one hand, it says that there is a selective delivery of urban governance across colonies and localities. That is one thing which is there. The second thing what it talks about is that how the state, because in this case water supply is distributed by the state, the government, and talking about at a time which is this work was done around the time of 2010-9, around that time. The state was favoring specific social groups or the other. So in some places we can see the slums getting removed, other places remaining. The water supply, which is very close to the slums, there is there's so much that people can waste it. So there is a tendency of specific social groups getting favored than the other. So these are some of the notions which come to our mind. Then, or otherwise the state is totally a cold onlooker. Otherwise it just ignores what's happening and let it happen, business as usual kind of a situation. So these are some of the scenarios, some of the strands of thoughts which comes in your mind when we see a thing like that, and that kind of disparity, inequity existing in the city. And then it talks about the selectivity of state. We'll come to that, how the state becomes selective and things like that. So these are some of the basic thoughts which come to our mind. And to consider the politics is totally out of it is will be something like a little bit naive and simplistic. In the sense, I'm not talking about politics or political parties and that. I'm talking about overall dynamics of the city and how the city works. So that politics of the city is very much prevalent in this. So, so what is it all about? I mean, what we are talking about in terms of this distributor. One is looking at distribution of resources, because planning is essentially distribution of resources. So there are some resources in hand, which mostly the scarce resource, and that scarce resource will be distributed across spaces. That is the basic notion of planning. And it has an ideological commitment to equity and justice in terms of resources and services in a democratic setup. Not in some other kind of a setup, but in a democratic setup, definitely it has an ideological commitment. Now, my central argument is that planning has within itself certain techniques, multiple techniques of governmentality, which results in politics of distribution with unpredictable consequences, which supersedes the policy of distribution. So there are 2-3 things comes in this discussion. One is what is the policy of distribution, how politics is different from policy, and how governmentality comes into picture. So these are 3 important things. And also I looked at in empirical studies. I will not get into this much detail. Empirical studies of water supply in Delhi. I looked at this because most of the city discourses, especially the planning related discourses, they're black and white discourse. That means there is a binary narrative: formal, informal, legal, not legal. Planned, unplanned, that kind of discussion, which is more like a binary narrative. Now, what one was looking at, one was trying to find out that there are a lot of multiple shades of urban existence and its politics. There are a lot of zones of gray between these black and white, and it is not necessarily between the black and white. Even within the black, there are a lot of shades of gray, or within the white, there are lots of shades of gray. So I looked at planned colonies, because that is supposed to be more like, we should get the services properly and things like that. On the most of the discourses are based on the informal settlements. I looked at formal planned settlements and looked at about, did a sample survey of about 1400, almost like 1500 plots and things like that, and across 8 wards in Middleswell, covering about over 1 lakh households. So based on that, I realized that and we looked at, I looked at this kind of a relationship, looked at water supply and how the water supply is distributed across the space, and therefore how one can read the city with that kind of distribution. So looked at the property tax data, which is an indicator of socioeconomic strata, and looked at, and one pays property tax because the house is legal, and therefore a legal property gives a property tax and gets the same status with any other legal property. But my study shows that the water supply by the state in 2010, 12, 13, 14, around that time, even before that, with the state distribution was, there is a multiplicity in the distribution. There are higher socioeconomic groups are getting better supply in terms of quantity of supply and things like that. So those are some of the observations. But rather than getting into that kind of discussions, let's look at why this whole point of equity and justice is the central critique. Because contemporary urbanism, why it is so important. Planning, as I discussed, planning talked about equitable distribution. It should be just distribution. And in independent India, because it started with that, with a welfare state model, with equality and liberty as its basic tenets, which is like ega liberte, and that kind of tenets. With that idea, there's an intention. The planning had the intention, and it was adopted in the policy of the government to take the new nation forward, to make the distribution much more equitable and just. So planning, actually what happens when planning is based on a consensus, means some people decide, come into consensus, agree upon things, and then the policy is formed. Any policy, and planning is a policy. So the policy is formed based on the consensus and driven by some ideology, because ideology interpolates the decisions. That means it actually influences and drives somebody's decision and way of thinking. So therefore, the planning also is based on an ideology, because planning in a democracy is different from planning in other aspects. But in reality, what happens, the different policies are implemented for different people and for spaces. A similar kind of policy which was supposed to be delivered across the space, it does not happen. What happens is almost like a firefighting. There's something, if there is a need for the there are very pressing need for something, that will be done in the beginning. Something will be done later. Some policy will be partially adopted in one place, completely adopted in other place, and things like that. So which is understood as governmentality. There are a lot of nuances to governmentality, but the multiple techniques of distribution in this case and governance is one can understand as governmentality. It started with a discussion of Michel Foucault and it became very popular in English language. Before that, it was in French. So governmentality is an idea which talks about not governance, but multiple techniques and strategies of governing of space and a set of people. So how this, if we make a diagram out of it, that ideology, that is maybe a welfare state ideology, it gives a policy. The policy will be conceptualized, because based on the ideology, the policy will be equity and distribution, equity and just distribution. That policy actually gets modified. The what is decided in the beginning, it modifies, and modified policy actually gets distributed happens. So that's what the reality is, that between the ideology and reality, there are the modified policy only gets distributed. As I discussed earlier, that something happens in one place for one side of people, it doesn't happen for the other side and other side of people. So because of the reality and the resource is scarce, and then that kind of selectivity happens, that what to do with the regulated or scarce resource, where to distribute, how to distribute, it becomes a different kind of decisions and techniques. And that is where the governmentality comes in picture. So the ideology, policy, and governmentality is connected in this manner, and then governmentality actually makes the policy modified once again, and that becomes the reality. So this circle is a very, very critical. This goes on so that governmentality modifies the policy, and then again it gets modified through reality, it gets implemented. So this thing this continues, and this part of the conceptualization of the policy sometimes is left alone. So this is the theoretical diagram, how things happen till the point of time the reality changes, and it actually changes the ideology, because the worldview is changed, the welfare state is changed, neoliberal state has come, so the worldview is changed, the ideology is changed, the policy also will change. So then again the same circle goes on. So this is a very critical construct in this whole discussion. Now, as we know, I'll just quickly go on these things, that as we know, the welfare state model, the planning was introduced for distributive justice. In Delhi was one of the places in which the physical planning started, in which the land was taken and it was redistributed so that the equitable distribution happens, and then resources can happen across the space. And Nehru was one of the chief, he started this discussion of this planning committee along with Subhash Bose. He started talking about this. At that point of time, both of them were quite inspired by the socialist ideals at that point of time. So the central concern was, as I said, the just distribution and delivery of resources and services. And comprehensive planning was one of the methods which was identified. So at that point of time, there are two models came up. One model was Chandigarh, and another model was Delhi. Delhi actually has been followed in many places. There are like subservient to Delhi model. There are many cities which have come up. So one was designed by the master, which was Le Corbusier, architect who designed the comprehensive master plan of Chandigarh. There are a lot of critiques of that, and it was master's plan, and Delhi was a master plan. So there are two different kind of cities which have come up. One was like a brilliant design by somebody, a great architect, an urbanist, and another one is meticulously worked out in state blueprint plan. So this is how it is, and there are a lot of criticism of both of them, especially Chandigarh's criticism. I would suggest people to look at James Scott's work on high modernist cities, and which is one of the most significant critics of Chandigarh. Delhi has its own share of critics. So what is the myth of planning? That one myth is that planning can be uniformly implemented across the city or nation, whatever. It doesn't happen, because it has inherent in its multiple techniques and strategies and implementation. A lot of times I have heard the planners talking about that we have done this planning, but it is not getting executed because of the politicians, etc., etc. I realize that even in the teaching, that planning discourses are totally kept out of any kind of political discourse. So Partha Chatterjee at one point of time said that what planning is, politics is not. What politics is not, planning is that. So that means there are almost two different things. Why he was talking about that and why it is so. So this relationship between the planning and politics in planning paradigm or dogma or in terms of teaching or in terms of practicing is utopian, and it is not grounded in reality. Why is it that? Because as I discussed, that planning is a policy, and policy, if we look at the etymology of policy, the word policy, how it comes, one sees that the policy is like a civil governance. It comes from a French word, policy, and which is a civil governance, which starts with the citizenship. It also talks about the consensus. The people will come together, make a decision, then only it will happen. Whereas the democracy, the basic basic constituent of democracy is disagreement and discussions and deliberation, and that is what the politics is all about. And so since the moment the planning is established, the policy is formed, it becomes post-democratic. That means the discussion happened before it actually took place. And that is the problem, the way the planning is organized. Though there are discussions of planning strategies, that there will be discussion with the citizen and deliberative planning, etc., etc. But in reality, it does not happen. Political constituencies are not really engaged within this. So the consensus happen before the deliberation. So that is the problem of implementation. It is, and that is why the politics of distribution takes place, because of certain selectivity. Now, how does this happen, politics of distribution? One thing is this: there is an argument, statist argument. There are many geographers which talks about this kind of an argument. We say that the state makes strategic decision making, that what to do, where to do, and how to do. And we have ample examples. I don't want to get into the details of it, how the state makes the selective distribution. It's not about water supply. It's about housing. It's about business. It's about economic policy, and so on and so forth. So state makes certain kind of selectivity what to do, because it's strategic. Second argument is political economy argument, in which one talks about the influential groups, which creates a location specific distributed decisions. In certain locations, certain influential group actually looks at and influences these discussions. The third is growth centric. There are certain growth coalitions, means there are interested people come together, looks at a growth situation, and therefore they try to create this distribution in their favor. This is another kind of argument. And there are also established discourses on this. The fourth one, which is very interesting, which is a state of exception, which is propagated by a post-structuralist Marxist theoretician, Giorgio Agamben, an Italian, talked about how the state, the sovereign, keeps itself out of the situation and take decisions and create an exception for certain things. And this is rampant, which happens. That's how some group of people or some space or some policies are actually because of its necessity, and necessity may be political, necessity may be ideological, it can be anything. And because of that, they take that out as an exception and then implement it. So these are the four broad theoretical notion in which the politics of distribution happens. And as I said, that empirical research which I have conducted also talks about even within the legal spaces and planned spaces, there are differences and gradations of delivery of water supply, something which is very basic and given by the state. So what happens is that even across the planned settlements, there are multiple gradations. And there is also unplanned settlements, which are informal settlements, slums, whatever. All that will create other kinds of multiple gradations also within the city. So then what one can see, that there is a city is almost like an equity mosaic or inequity mosaics. The notion of equity is often understood by how inequity persists or exists in a part of the city. So if we see, let's say, if we look at anything, for example, if the water supply, the way I have looked at, or we see that any scarce resource distribution, if we start putting it, map it within the city, we'll be able to figure out that some area is better than the other, and it may be adjoining area, and there may or may not be much of technical reasons. There are a lot of people, engineers will say there will be technical reasons because of which some area will not get the water supply, other area will get. But we all know that technical reasons can overcome if some influential group is existing or a person is existing in a particular part of the city. So therefore, one can see that there are multiple levels of equity exist or inequity exists across the city, and this is what one can. There is a way of reading the city that is in that equity mosaics, which creates many shades of gray within the city. And this is not necessarily this rich poor kind of a binary divide. There are multiple existence, multiple geographies within the city existing. So I want to highlight this point time and again, because there's a binary narrative needs to be broken in many ways, and this is one of the ways, and there are many other possibilities. Now, this gives a notion called assorted. How is the city built? I mean, they are almost like assorted. Even if it is planned, we see that things are coming together. Is almost like an assortment. So this is we believe that perhaps this is one way we can understand the post-informational cities, especially. So one sees that what are the why an assortment happens. An assortment happens because I gave a chocolate example, because the chocolate is what we get to know about assorted chocolate. So one needs to know why it happens. One is that sometimes it happens because of the richness. That means you want to create a richness in a city, so the assortment happens. So certain kind of interesting uses come together, mixed use cities are created, some landmarks are created. So there is a richness. That's why assortment happens. Another kind of assortment happens because of affordability, that you cannot afford more than that. Therefore, there are cheaper things and also the ones which are more expensive ones. That's why you create an assortment, and you also create the city like that, and because of which different kinds of markets, different kind of residences, and so there's the variations which exist, so that the people or the people have a choice, and based on their affordability they can choose something. The cities are also created like that. Third one is the scarcity, because you don't get what you want, and therefore something else come up. You don't do what you are supposed to do, so something else come up. So there is an absence of something, there is a scarcity of something, so assortment happens. So there are three things, and Indian cities also have all these reasons for its assortment: the richness for some part of its city, the affordability, and therefore the multiple groups staying. Slum is one of the examples of that, in which the scarcity and affordability comes together. Something which was supposed to be built, it was not built, left open, and then other kind of activities come in because of the affordability in the city. So these are more or less broadly the term. Now, one of the classic example I would say is Gurgaon of this. It starts with the way the land is controlled by the villagers, by government agencies like Huda, by multiple big developers. So the land itself becomes almost like estates. So the assortment starts right from the beginning, and it continues. So if we look at one road, which is a very important road in Gurgaon in 2002, and I did few architectural studios with the students also on this road. This is Mehrauli Gurgaon Road. This is Mehrauli Gurgaon Road in 2002, and one can see there are multiple plots like this existing across which some of them are not even built. So you see these particular areas, how it gets built over the years, and how the city actually starts. So from here, everything gets in. So we'll come to the next one. We'll see that. This is in 2008, more or less this area started filled up. This whole area started filled up. like that. And even this one, which was earlier, was not there. So in 2020, it is even more. But what happens here? There's a main street, and each of them are plugged onto the street itself. So each enclaves and plots are almost like the big commercial plots are accessed from the street. They have no interrelationship. So, for example, this particular area, one has to come from a narrow stretch and then get in, or something like that. So, and for here, it comes in here in this area, but it is accessed from here. So even this particular one, it get access plugged onto the road. So it's everything is going to the road, but there is not connections in between. So what I say, that these are the enclaves in post-informational cities. They are globally connected but locally isolated. So this is like a set of isolated enclaves joined together by a street, accessed from the street. So what it happens is that there is like a street as an armature. It comes up. And that's how the post-informational cities are being done. First, the roads are connected, roads are built, and you will see there is a tremendous urge to make the roads because it not only makes transport better, it also has a huge amount of capital investment. And when there is a capital investment in a project, it benefits many people. And because of one of the reasons, and second thing is that the moment the road is made, the land is accessible, and therefore it is for speculation and development. And the more development happens, it interests many people. So the roads are created, and then the enclaves are made, and enclaves are connected. So this is the basic nature of contemporary cities. Though some of the planned cities, they believed that this is not the situation, but it actually happened in this manner, as I was talking about in the context of Delhi, though it is not so obvious as it's in Gurgaon, but still it could not prevent this kind of assortment to happen. Now, this phenomenon is existing. I'll end, this is the last part of my discussion. So when this assortment happens, there are in-between spaces created, interfaces are created, interstitial margins are created between enclaves, between the enclaves and the city. So there are no man's land which is created. And most of these are neglected landscape. And that's why this notion of landscape urbanism comes in, how to look into this landscape and try to make it into more public space, and so that it can join and bring the cities together. And it is so obvious in most of the places, is across time and space this happens. So on one hand, we see a distributive inequity and shades of gray in terms of a very basic supply like water supply and distribution of resources. On one hand, leads to a kind of understanding of assorted city. But at the same time, we see that in urban form, that implication of assorted city is also one of the aftermath is a landscape, especially the city landscape. This is example of Jaipur. I'll just quickly see a couple of examples and then say that this is one of the important, this is the most important city level axis, which connects most of the major landmarks. The walled city ends here, but still it goes out, goes to the Albert Hall, and it goes on. This is the JLN mark, and it goes on, if people are aware of Jaipur, and it goes up to the Nahargarh hill, this area, and there is a temple. So it connects the temple, and there are number of things happen here. The city palace, then Govind Dev Ji temple, which was the complete the beginning of the Jaipur city. Talkatoora Lake, which is a man-made lake. There are parks and things like that. So I looked at a map in University of Chicago website. I was involved in Jaipur project. So see that Talkatoora Lake was full of water body around. It was a collected water system. The water was coming down, collected here, and there was a water body here. and from all water was collected to Kolkata Lake, overflow goes into a larger water body, then it gets connected to another one, Mansagar Lake, which is a large Jalmol palace is there. So that is the water system, how they are looking at the surface drainage. And in 1914, this Survey of India map shows that this water body is still existing. This particular water body is already existing. Now, if we see that, if we see this, just a moment, this one. Now, this is a photograph around that time. This is an exhibition I happened to see in Jaipur. So this is the hill. This is the Mansagar Lake, which I was talking about, Mansagar Lake. And this is the lake which used to exist in the beginning of 20th century. And this is Talkatura Lake. Now, what happens is today it is like this. This Mansagar Lake is somewhere here that exists. That whole area of water area that's called Raja Malki Talao is totally built up, and this Talkatura Lake is amidst such a dense surroundings. This is one kind of assortment in which the landscape gets neglected. Landscape becomes the backspace of the city, because the city is only understood from the roads. So the roads gives the access to the city, and therefore it is built up, whereas the landscape remains in the background. That is why such kind of decisions are taken, and this creates a lot of other issues of urban flooding and other kinds of things. This is not only in Jaipur. It is a historic precinct in Jaipur. Now, if you're talking about Buckingham Canal, now there are a lot of canal sensitivities being done. Competitions are happening. Things are like. This is the Buckingham Canal, and today we know that Chennai at one point of time had a huge flood. Today also there is a cyclone which is going to happen, or is happening at this moment. So this Buckingham Canal was a man-made canal by the Britishers, which was handling the flood situation in a very cheap manner. That canal, which was like this earlier, and it became like this now. And if you go on, you will see this is the canal edge, and this the metro line also has come on top of it. If we look at not only in Buckingham Canal, if we look at in Kolkata, the Tolik Nala, we see that this kind of assortment happens. One kind of dense fabric, then the not so dense, sparse Alipur fabric, and again the dense fabric. So the city turned its back. If we look at the photographs, again there's an assortment. The landscape is towards the backside. So this is what happens. The metro line goes on top of it, and this is a generic issue, whether it is Mulasari Canal in Kochi or in Kolkata or in Chennai. Everywhere this happens. Now, you look at this Calcutta Canal situation, one will realize what happens and how this the nature of assortment happens. Now, these are the roads. These roads actually gives the access to these spaces. The moment the roads gives access to these spaces, the canals becomes the backdrop, because this area will be accessed from this area will be accessed from this. So all the back spaces come together, which used to be an important gateway to the city, actually becomes, because of this assorted nature, it actually becomes on the backspace. And that's why one of the major reasons of assortment is not necessarily the people of lower income strata or lower or they will get less water supply or less basic services and things like that. the landscape also, which is a soft area of the city, that also gets problematic. And I see that these kind of things happening in Gurgaon also. Similarly, because there used to be a canal here, which is like Wazirabad Canal, which used to take the water from the Aravallis, which used to drain. This was the canal. So the from Aravalli, this sharp drop, it used to come to the canal, the water, and then it used to irrigate the area. Because you will see in Delhi, in most of the cities, especially in Delhi and in Gurgaon and these areas, the erstwhile villages are next to the canals, because from the canal they used to take the water, and there's the agricultural land used to be there next to it. All those things have been occupied by real estate, but the canals remained, and the canal became Nala because it was the irrigation was not happening. Sewer system got in, and you will see that the similar kind of canal, which which was in Calcutta, which was in between multiple parts of the city. In Gurgaon too, the similar existence is there. There is a high-rise building. There is like a akhara kind of an area, and then all of them actually come together next to various kinds of enclaves come together next to the canal. All of them are accessed from the road. I will show that. So there is a majestic gates from the roads to the enclaves, but the landscape is behind, and therefore landscape. This is the photograph of this. This landscape is totally neglected. It is no man's land. It's a dump yard, and only place where the city enters into the landscape in this assorted nature are in some points where the roads and canals are meet, and we can see this is how it happens. It's a coexistence of pigs and people who are sitting and drinking and things like that. That is the kind of space in the city. And we see these are the spaces which exist in this whatever behind the shine and gloss of the assorted city. So we had this opportunity of working on this as an urban project with city interest groups, and there are NGOs funded by the corporates. And we made this project. Our office worked on this as designers, and we tried to create with the native plants, with the very minimum interventions. We try to create a space which is a public space where people, the same space became like this after the intervention. And this is not a gated space. Anybody can enter, anybody can use. So this is the space which slowly begins to hold some public activities of various kinds of groups of people coming, domestic servants, domestic helps. They are going to their work. Earlier, they used to feel insecure. The various age groups, they take walks here. So this becomes a public space. So the point one is talking about there is a the distribution of services, not only services in the sense of like water supply, electricity, and so on and so forth, distribution of services in terms of housing and other things. It creates a kind of assorted nature, and that the politics of it and the delivery of it, which is based on governmentality decisions rather than policy decisions, because of which there is a politics of distribution happens. And out of politics of distribution, certain kind of irregularity happens in the city, and the assorted nature of the city gets evolved, which is very, very predominant today in post-informational cities, where the cities are going out of planning dogma. Places like Gurgaon, where the planning document and master plan is trying to catch up the speed of the city's growth. So when planning documents are kept aside, this kind of cities are actually growing more and more across India, from larger cities to a smaller area. Smaller cities are even more predominant in this kind of trend, where there is no planning bodies are existing. There are, and one of the major, in urban form wise, one of the major suffers the landscape of the city, which earlier used to hold the city together. So if we look at that, and there are possibilities also we can see, I wanted to end it with a happy note that there are possibilities of actually engaging with these landscapes and engaging with the people and try to make public spaces we actually hold together these disparate groups which tend to stay in these enclaves in these assorted city. And with that, I will end the discussions, and I'll be glad to take the questions on and take forward the discussions to different directions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biswas, for your insightful and theoretically enriching presentation and the lecture. And mainly during the presentation, you have pointed out the unevenness precisely, which is there within the Indian cities. For example, you started with your presentation with specifically with respect to the water supply, and you have showed how unequal or how inequity in access to the urban services. And you have shown that the state responses or the arrangements, they are also favoring certain specific socioeconomic groups, and which is, according to your point of view, is quite contrary to the ideological commitment of planning towards equity and justice. And then you draw attention to the difference between politics and policies, and very powerfully argued that the binary narratives, the predominant binary narratives of Indian cities is problematic, and therefore they need to be broken. So it is important for us to understand the multiple shades of urban existence. And because you have said that the different policies are implemented for different people, and that is why the lens of governmentality, that means the multiple strategies for governing both the people and spaces are very much important, and how they interact with the socio-political specificities of the cities. So these are very much important if we really want to understand the actual city making process in India. And also it has been quite clear from your presentation that in the context of Indian cities, planning as such cannot be, or rather should not be, kept out of politics. And that is why the processes and outcomes of policy, outcomes of policies of distribution is very much uncertain. And you drew your attention to certain aspects like selective distribution by the state, then location-specific distributive decisions, growth-centric distributive decisions, and state of exceptions, how these are actually leading to the distributive inequities which are central to the city characteristics. And in fact, then it actually leads to the understanding of assorted cities, in which the richness, the aspects of richness, affordability, scarcity, these are very crucial aspects. And also in the final stages of your presentation, you have mentioned, like in the process of the assortment, how some in-between spaces or no man's land, they have emerged. And also how some specific points that find their place are mentioned in the planning mechanism. So ultimately the distribution of services is majorly political, though you also said that there are certain possibilities to engage with them to improve them as public places and so on and so forth. So thank you for your insightful presentation and all these things. But before I have a couple of questions, but before placing those questions, I think we have Mr. Samir Unale sir with us. So may I now request Arjun to introduce Samir Unale sir, so that he can present his observation on Dr. Biswas' presentation. Arjun, are you there?
Yes, Samir sir, are you ready?
Yes, Arjun, I am there because I am traveling. My camera will be shut off because I am traveling. I can listen. Please, Arjun, thank you.
Yes, so Mr. Samir Unale is a Joint Commissioner at a Department of Municipal Administration in Government of Maharashtra. Prior to this assignment, sir was also the CEO of Smart City Thane city, and he has hold several places in different capacity in city governance. I think that is very relevant for this discussion because the ubiquitous nature of service delivery, or how the build form, we have master plan and many things. So I really wanted to have one administrative point of view, that there are also assortments in various departments per se. Sir, your thoughts? Yes.
Yes, very good evening. First of all, as an administrator, this presentation was very insightful, because in our day-to-day functioning, we keep on working on file and meetings. But the broader discipline and the broader framework into which the issues are operating is very enlightening to know that. And it's definitely very helpful. And in this way, I would like to congratulate IMPRI for, having this continuous city conversations. So that was the first response on that. Secondly, there has, as I keep on mentioning, that there is no special discipline or a subject matter of cities anywhere. We have various perspectives and various disciplines which work and think on the city space. The more closest discipline, if at all, would be this discipline of planning. But land use planning is important, but is not cannot explain the totality of the complex dynamics which are currently operating any city, and probably that's the reason why there are limitations into what is planned and what you actually see in the city. This divergence is increasing day by day. So when the master plan is made and when it is talk of its ultimately duration is over, what you see on ground is totally different to what has happened. So probably, as we had discussed, I think earlier, that we will have to think of new dimensions and new framework into which cities can be planned, what can be planned, and for what duration it should be planned. Otherwise, we might just be making maps which do not coincide with the territories. Use of new technology, real-time data acquisition, big data, sensors, GIS mapping, maybe predictive governance, artificial intelligence, and a host of new technologies needs to also to be considered into how cities are operating. Of course, that may not be entirely explain everything, but the complexity and the magnitude of situations is increasing so much that the old 20 or 30-year-old approach will be not sufficient to tackle the way cities will have to be managed. We are seeing greater and greater difference in the way maybe the G20 or the OECD or the developed countries are handling their cities as compared to the cities of global south. So this was just a broader framework. I thought, because every day greater challenges are coming up, and somewhere there is a feeling deep inside that something needs to be done, and done very fundamentally. Because tinkering on the surface probably would not really make any credible impact on the lives of the millions of Indian city dwellers that we have. Secondly, I think this issue of urbanity and informality, and how the how the city spaces, public spaces are being, interacted, operated, and is there anything that can be done to make the life less miserable there? The comparison of two lakes and what they happen afterwards, and how the people are interacting there was very illuminating. In fact, earlier when I was working with the earlier city, we are in fact known as the city of lakes. We have around 35 lakes there, and the discussion what we had was I could really correlate to what things were being discussed with what we saw on ground. Thirdly, I think the broader framework in which the forces that are playing in Indian cities, I think we still are struggling to evolve a appropriate conceptual framework for that. I mean, this is not as an administrator, but somewhere sometimes I find that it is, I mean, planning in Indian cities would be like atmospheric sciences. You are predicting that there will be rainfall tomorrow, and it never happens. Somewhere that that feeling of deficiency is now getting very stronger in me, that it's very difficult to correlate how the millions of people are leading their life in cities, and what we discuss and what we plan on paper somehow doesn't really make any great relevance to the citizens that we are living in. So that I think is a major point for us. And sometimes it's scary, the challenges that we are seeing ahead. It might be a pandemic, it might be climate change, it might be mobility constraints, it might be water, it might be all the aspects. Something needs to be done, and two approaches which could be useful would be, of course, community engagement. We have to trust our people more, that they are capable of handling their issues up to a limit. And beyond that, I think it has to be teamwork. It has to be community, it has to be corporate, it has to be technology, it has to be all sections of society that will that are need to be allowed to make an impression on how the decisions are being made. In fact, when you talk of service, it is solid waste management, it might be water, it might be sewerage, it might be mobility. Of course, this is such a great challenge now onto us, that in COVID times, with public transport having some limitation, those who could afford private transport could do that. But what of the people, who couldn't use it? So these indications are coming up very strongly as to what that's something substantial, that substantial needs to be done. And the challenges will have to be resolved with a very different probably paradigm, and greater different way of working. If we are just trying to repeat our earlier system of functioning, then I'm afraid we might not able to rise up to the occasion. So of course, this as not being an not being a any subject expert into this thing, it was more of some stray remarks. And what again, the initiatives that has been done under IMPRI needs to be done at a greater frequency, and there needs to be greater collaboration and conversations of people working in different sector, as well as people of different callings, that needs to come and try to resolve the issues, because ultimately the totality will have to be considered, and the totality will have to be involved to solve this all the challenges that we have. So Arjunji, these were some simple, very simple reactions and responses that I had in my mind. And of course, after if there's any other issue, I can always join again. It is always a pleasure to be a part of such discussions. So thank you, Arjunji. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Yes. Soumyadip, sir, over to you.
So, would you like? Well, fine. So, would you like to respond to Mr. Soumyadip's comments?
Yeah, I think he has summed up the whole discussion very well, actually. There is no one way of understanding the city. That is what one was talking about. But yes, that is absolutely right. One needs to understand the city is also not one. So, what he has highlighted, that it is planning documents, which makes one document for 40 years or 30 years or 20 years, that planning period. The way the things, technology is changing, where the way of living is changing, the quality of life is changing. 20 years back, we did not know the power of technology like the way we are discussing today. Even maybe 2 years back, we had this technology and we are not using it. And we are forced to use it because of the global pandemic. And we realize that this kind of discussions are possible. So it locational specificity is getting diluted. So geographic proximity is not so important. Whether you are on the network or not, that is more important now. So there are ways of understanding the city, and the city is not one entity. It has multiplicity, and therefore there are multiple tactics required, which is more like and the planning should be much more flexible. That is one was talking about. Instead of a plan at the end of it, there should be more flexibility to be given, autonomy to be given in the way it can operate, and it can change and things like that. And state as a overall overarching planning agency or should be able to guide certain structural decisions for planning, so that rest of the things can fit in. So these are broad ideas one can think of. Somebody has asked whether I know any example of ideal inclusive city and all that. I don't know, because idealism is not, I mean, ideal situation is not really existing, in the sense that we cannot say, because the notion of equity is changing. Earlier it was different, now it is different. So time is changing. Earlier what happened was I tell you how it happens. For example, when we studied, if we are not staying in the main cities, we are in hinterland, we had less information. So information was major thing at that point of time, when we studied, or maybe when we are much younger at our growing time. Today's that is not, information is not an issue, because the same information somebody sitting in New York is going to get somewhere in the hinterland, in near Sundarbans. If only thing is that, does the person have the access to the network or not? If he or she has the access, they will get the information. So information is not an important thing. The knowledge out of the information important thing. So the paradigm changes. Therefore, equity is no longer about the distribution or access to the knowledge. It is access to technology. So this is why there's a equity parameters is always something which gets changed. But are our cities working towards equitable distribution of resources and services or not? That is more important. What are the decisions which are taken? How city is pushing forward? It is not about whether there is an ideal inclusive city existing or not. It is about how far we are pushing ourselves to get an inclusive city. That is the more important discussions at this point of time, and which Samirji also has pointed out about, because he has worked extensively on smart cities, which I also had worked as experts. So we can see that the smart city is not about planning, it's about projects to some extent, delivery of the projects and things like that. Lots of planners are not very comfortable about smart city because there is no planning required, planning involved in that. Now, when the projects happen, there are many things required for the projects. For example, there will be political representative which will come. They will put their thoughts in it. So this engagement has to happen much more proactively. And that is how the cities will be more dynamic. Cities will be more adaptable to changes. Some part of the city is to be looked at differently than the other parts. So flexibility in terms of in a tool of planning has to, or handling the city has to happen. So these are some of the things which I think. And someone also asked whether those urban farming is recommended. Yes, it is recommended. I mean, there are a lot of areas the urban farming happens. So, and it is very much required to some extent, using the land effectively. Urban farming on Yamuna River bed has its own dynamics, has its own politics, how it happens. So there are a lot of work on that also. Conceptually speaking, urban farming can be done. So that's not an issue. Dr. Chattopadhyay.
Yeah. Well, thank you. In fact, we have answered some of my questions which I was supposed to raise after this. So anyway, but I have some very basic questions. Like, first of all, I'm very curious to know the difference between governance and governmentality. This is purely an academic question, because I'm not, I could not get the difference between governance and governmentality. So
Governance has its own structure in which it operates, because there's an established how you govern. There is a set structure, governance structure on which it operates. Governmentality is the mentality of mentality behind how you govern. So that is the thing that is essential, and the technique of governing people. So that technique of governing people changes in if you look at, mainly it starts with the discussion of Michel Foucault. It is almost like there is no standard set and set practices. So whatever is required at one point of time, you will try to govern that in one way, other one you will do the other way. So it's almost like the way the politics works. So it's almost like the way the firefighting happens. Where there is a fire, you do something. Where there is not, there is something. So multiple techniques and flexibility of governance is what the governmentality is all about. And that flexibility is created out of situation, because of various situations I talked about, as a that creates the politics of whether it is distribution of in terms of transport, in terms of water, in terms of services, in terms of housing, in terms of putting an industry in some places. There are multiple decisions happen. Now we were told, for example, I just give you one example how just to in a simplistic manner. For example, there are we heard in our school days we saw that that to have an industry you need water, you need this. There's many requirement, a geographic requirement to have an industry. But if you look at today, do you think that such kind of assessments happen when the industry is set up, or there are other kind of decisions? So those other kind of decisions are actually driven by politics, and that is the way that particular decision to govern is under the governmentality. So in a simple manner, that is what I can say, that it has so same policy but multiple techniques of implementation. That is what and multiple strategies is what governmentality is different from governance. For governance, it will have a similar strategy for similar policy. So that is why the governmentality is different.
Well. So thank you. So that means the socio-spatial imaginarity is by different groups of people. Like when we are seeing or we heard about the world-class cities. So the imaginaries of world-class cities is different from what the cities that the poor people they want to see. Okay, so if will the differences in such visions of two disparate groups with their differences, different needs and priorities will have some impact on this making of assorted cities?
I mean, world-class city is to some extent is a tag. I mean, it's like a topic of a seminar that I have seen this discussion happened of one world-class city. In Pragati Maidan once, and there was architects were discussing, and there are two important people are discussing. So one was talking about how the city should be made in the cities like European cities, and another person was talking about how the city should be slumless. So both this discussion started with such a utopia, not really utopia. They're almost like started with a dystopia. So in which you talk about situations which is so imaginary, then it becomes a problem of executing. So what one is talking about here, the notion that assortment happens in many ways. Assortment, as I said, the three main ways assortment happens, and sometimes it is deliberate, sometimes it is not so deliberate. But we get a city which we thought that we have planned it to the last plot, but we get a city which is of assorted nature. And there are so many slums even within the so many slums which is within also the places which are very, very well understood. I mean, which is like a very rich area or posh area, quote unquote, important areas. Behind that, there are certain kinds of underbelly of the city which exists, which is like a no man's land, like landscape areas, which I talked about, the landscape, canals, and things like that. So this assorted nature is a very generic thing, and we must. My only point of this discussion is that we must understand the city's nature. This is the nature of the city. So we need to address it in that nature. If we understand it as monolith, we understand it is was one thing, then there is a problem. So as Samirji was talking about, there is not one notion which can, or one technique or which can handle the whole of the city. That becomes a problem. If somebody thinks that, okay, I made a master plan and therefore I will regulate the city right from to till the plot, is a utopia. So is not a possibility. So how to understand that, how to make the projects, so, and how to understand a city, make up planning, these thing decisions, these are to be seen city by city, based on much more understanding, a more detailed reading or more detailed study, things like that. There are lot of projects being done here now where there's no background studies. So, and we make a project and we realize that, we realize at the end of it what mess has happened. So from the project level to the city level, one needs to develop a scale in which we need to make our decisions to operate. So I think that understanding of scale is very important, which changes from city to city. So I hope I could address what you were saying.
So, well, now may I now request Arjun to, if you please have your comments or.
Yes, thank you, sir. In this, first of all, let me congratulate and really using more of pictures to make us understand what is happening over time. So one question really come to my mind, not as architect or like urban planner, but really as an economist, that when we are saying assortment, then are there any magnitude by which have you tried also to look into the level of assortment? Because when this assortment is happening, there are also cases, what in economics we see convergence or divergence from any nature, as you are suggesting. The city's expansion, or as there are also different stages of city. There are more of a metropolis, or there is also area extension for Jaipur and many cities, our growing cities, which you have seen. Sir, what in your view do you think that the small cities have lesser assortment or the bigger ones? Because India is a really big city bias, and for our water canals and other things also, does this assortment is happening more in our bigger cities than the smaller ones? And how does the rural and the regional planning interact with this? Another thing I really wanted to know, that we have master plans, we have so many of documents, smart cities, Amrut, so many of program, and I think now all of our programs are handled by the consultancies, mostly MNCs, all of them world class. Then because what we are envisaging and what we are seeing is really very different. So what is also leading to that? And then who would be responsible for this sort of assortment? You have really, for the last few decades, the place where I live, in Saket, Delhi, you really touched upon GK, and then also the Gurgaon side. I have really seen in last 1-2 decades how this has been done there, but there are also ways and means, because there is also private development, and those developments, you also showed some of the good projects which you have done. There are really success stories within that city. There are enterprises which are making it possible and completely changing the things. But when it is coming for more on the service delivery part, then our city or city departments then become more of engineer, then it's like they make a mess out of it. So how do you see that who is responsible, and what about this assortment of the varied capacity we have? Private sector also have scale problem, various issue. But why isn't our governance getting smart when you rightly mentioned in Pragati Maidan, it has World Expo and various things. We have the knowledge, we have the capability. Then why it is not going forward? Because you have studies all the East India, South, North, West Indian studies. And what do you think should be the way forward? Are we lacking more so in terms of policy, or what would lead to the more livers or teeth, so that we really have aesthetics and other things intact, but also able to serve also our growing population? So I would stop here. You can choose anything, yes, to answer or not.
So what I would talk about this in this one or two things. One is you mentioned about this engineering driven aspect. One is that. Second thing, what you have also talked about is this what are the ways it can be handled and things like that. So and there are other issues which you have highlighted. So what I would say that I would not really predict here because this is like too premature to say that this is to be done, that is to be done, because that is not the purpose. The purpose is how do we read it. If we read something to some extent, we recognize that there is an assortment, therefore, and this is how the cities are growing. As you mentioned, that most of the hinterlands of the big cities, there's a road made and the land is being sold. That's the part, that's what is happening in most of the areas, because Gurgaon is an epicenter of that. I mean, Gurgaon had a law, I mean, act in which the roads were, the development along the road were encouraged at one point of time. So but I've seen it. You have also seen, many of us, we have seen the road is made. Till some point, the road is metalled. Rest of the thing is kacha, that is like a mud track. Till the point the road was made by the government, but the state. The developers take the land was sold, and etc., and then road was taken forward. So this is how development happened, and most of the hinterland in the bigger cities or in the smaller cities, this is what happens. The urban extensions are called because of this, that they're extended from the main body. So the assortment nature is there right in the beginning. Second thing, what happens is, when you plan something, but because of its nature, there are things happening, because Delhi never was planned as set of enclaves, but eventually, because of the security and insecurity reason, the Delhi has been turned itself almost like enclaves. Like each of them, Sundarnagar has a wall around, which we have seen, such a lovely place, the road, and there was a there was a park just at the lower level. They're all gone because of the wall. And the more and more these walls and enclaves are created out of it, the problem also happens in terms of public space. As I was talking about these canals in Gurgaon, which we try to rejuvenate that space, which was a band earlier, which was like a mud quay kind of a thing. And when we started intervening there, the rest of the adjoining housings, they had they were taken aback what's happening, because they were thinking that some privacy is being lost and things like that. And some of them were very curiously objecting, come asking what's happening. But at the end, once the project was done, they wanted to open their gate and get into this. So the more and more these kind of smaller projects, smaller interventions also can happen. So we should look at in the scale of operation, scale of this thing. That is what I am more concerned, that what is the scale to operate and intervene in the city. That is one level. I'm talking about urban design, urban planning level. There is a distribution of services which we are talking about, and I have discussed that at length. Third thing, what you have talked about is this: who is responsible, and who is responsible is very difficult to pinpoint who is responsible. But let's look at this example of smart city, which I have seen quite extensively. One is this this engineer-driven city that has its own problem, because engineers, to some extent, are hedgehogs. They are very good in one thing and they do that thing very well, but they keep on doing that thing very well. But somehow cities needs foxes who can plug and play in many ways. So that is what is missing in most of these urban projects. And in smart city case, what happens is that it starts with a problematic thing. It has and another thing which you said, that policy is good. All policies are good. Only thing is that the way the policy is then implemented, because it does not recognize the politics of implementation, then this problem happens. In most of the smart city, the earlier ones especially, there used to be a smart city office, the government office, government officers that there, headed by a CEO, or and reporting to the principal secretary or whatever, like that. They have this municipal engineers. The problem, and municipal engineers were taking decisions of the projects which PMC is doing and things like that. So when the municipal engineers are not really exposed to many things in that sense, and many smart city organizations, government organizations, did not really fill up those slots of other personas which were required. That is one thing. Second thing was that cross departmental integration was required, which was not happening, because many places that they become like a domain. If somebody, if the CEO and the smart city organization, in number of places they are very open-ended, they have taken interpretations. Those ones have done very well. The ones which worked in almost like they're within their own cells, and it is my domain, that is their domain kind of a thing, that had a problem. Third thing which was there also, because these engineer-driven decisions, because technical decisions were taken by the engineers, a superintendent engineer will approve it, and then it will go to the CEO. So their exposures were problematic. So their capacity building is required in most of the places if they are to be incorporated in this kind of any urban projects like this. Another thing what happens is that most of the projects are done on the basis of schedule of rate, established schedule of rates. And that established schedule of rates, the smart city demands something goes beyond time. I mean, you're talking about technology and things like that, and quite a number of things were not really present in that sense in the schedule of rate, or it was not adequately represented, because schedule of rate was made some time back. There is a process that if it is not there, then you have to take certain procurement process, but it is not really adopted to that extent. So the moment we look at this, go by these most of these documents, whether it's a planning document, whether it's a bylaw document, text based most of the cases, and whether we are going by the schedule of rates, this agility of these documents are to be understood. You need to be agile. The document needs to be agile. Planners needs to be agile, because of the nature of the cities, because it's changing very fast. One thing is not happening, although we try to do it, but it does not happen like that. So this complexity needs to be understood to some extent in the decision making. So that is what I feel in the decision making, not in terms of only the only the bureaucrats and others. Decision making, even in the project, people who are doing the private multinationals, as you are talking about, those projects, those people needs to. So any decision related to city needs to be much more agile. The documents need to be much more agile, and as Samirji was talking about, it needs to have more citizen engagement, in not as just to tick a box, but as a proactive measure. So that is what is missing at this moment to some extent. In some places it happens, some places it does not happen. So I hope I could address your long questions which you raised.
Yes, rightly. So we also have Anshula. Anshula lives in GK, where you did your study, and nearby also there is a slum, and Zamrudpur, their metro mishap also happened, and a lot of things. That area, very interesting area. Anshula, why don't you come in? Anshula is our assistant director, and looks after research. Anshula?
Yes, good evening, sir, and thank you for such an insightful presentation.
Anshula, go on.
Is there an echo? Okay, my question is, so what are your views on the connection between gender security and the built environment over the last few decades, and how does assortment affect safety in public spaces? And what would your recommendations be in this regard to sort of foster or preserve that safety or security?
Yeah, gender issues, one of the most important issues in terms of this when this assorted nature of the city, in the sense, as I was discussing, this assortment understanding of assorted city, one level is conceptual because that is delivery based. Another one is physical, because that's how cities are done, as the example of Gurgaon we are talking about, in cities in Calcutta also. Calcutta is also like that. There are many cities like this, part of Bombay is also like that. So the assorted nature is existing, is more like a generic nature. Now, in many places what happens is not, in some cities they accommodate within that assortment, tries to create the public space, because the interstitial spaces are converted into public space rather than no man's land. Some other cities create those between the enclaves, that creates those spaces becomes no man's land. And the gender safety and insecurity is maximum in those no man's land to some extent. On a city space, whether it is on the street. In GK, people will not really walk on the streets because all the time it is edged by tall boundary walls. In the cities where you have natural proprietors, which Jane Jacobs talks about, natural proprietors of the street, people who have their eyes on the street, those are the places where there are activities happening. One is the safety, whether it is gender safety or any other safety, everything is there in that sense. In this particular project which we are talking about, the Bandh project in Gurgaon, earlier there used to be these maids who used to go cycling through these places to most of their colonies where they are working. So in some stretches they used to go out and then go on the main road and come back, because it was dark, it was dingy, it was scary, because people used to sit and drink country liquor. And it was a mess. Nobody looked at it, so it remained as a dark space. The moment it became better, then they started owning the space, and lights came in. Some corporates said that okay, they will do the CSR funding. Some lights came in. I'm talking about a very small project in which it gets illuminated. People and the ladies also can go now. So I've seen that, because most of them came and asked, light lagega ya nahi lagega, and things like that. There are a lot of discussions on the projects are getting done. So yes, your one thing is that more and more public spaces we create, we address the issues of safety and security. And I think most of the Indian cities in contemporary time, we should take the onus of not being able to create the public spaces. That is the failure in terms of urban planners and urban designers and policymakers all together, because our our ideas are not really create public spaces. We want to create a property. So the moment we get something, we put a boundary wall all around. So we try to create a property, so that is a problem. That becomes a problem, and city also suffers for that. One example is Chiang Kai-cheong canal improvement. I'm sure most of you may have heard, in the South Korea, which used to be a river, Chiang Kai-cheong River, which used to be a blighted space, a dark spaces. There are a lot of crimes happening at one point of time. Then there was a bridge on top of it for a high-speed traffic. So one politicians actually argued and canvassed for. He became the mayor later, and his campaign was to bring back the river into the Chiang Kai Cheong and make it a culture space and public space. And after he became the mayor, based on that campaigning, he piece by piece took out that that overhead corridor and the flyover, and bring back the water there, and it became one of the most celebrated public space in Seoul. So these are small instances which brings a dark space back into the city, and which was created because of the nature in which things happened one after the other without really looking at the landscape of it. So that is one kind of situation. Other kind of situation is where you don't give the access to water supply, and people have to jump on the water tank and collect water. So that creates another kind of social unrest, because somebody coming up in the morning, getting up at 6 o'clock, putting the water bucket for water, it is a struggle in the city. So these are some of the issues which are problematic. But in terms of security, gender security, the public open space, public space is to be understood and realized, created more and more as we make any project or any for any part of the city.
So, well, thank you. And I'm seeing another question for you. It's from one of our participants. The question is something like, does the Assorted cities have an SOP towards attainment of SDGs? Or is it an enigma in India, or we have examples from abroad as well?
No, I actually explained that one will not have the example, or it is not really looking at the SDGs and all that. It is a way of reading. There are similar ways of reading, like Collage City, for example, done by Kolkata, which is a very one of the most original, fascinating way of reading cities. Kolkata and Fred Quater, both of them taught in the US and practiced. They understood the city as a collage. It's in late 70s book called Collage City. The discussion was between the modernist city and the traditional city, and therefore there's a kind of collage which was happening between two kinds of urban textures which were happening. A texture like a New Delhi and Shajanabad, to put it in a very simple manner, or an old Jaipur and new Jaipur. So there's a kind of collage was happening, and autonomy of collage was happening. So that is one way of understanding of the city. There's another reading which is recent in 2005. Columbia's Professor David Graham Shen has proposed recombinant urbanism, which is also similar. And he explains the post-informational cities based on three things. One is armature, like the roads, then the enclaves, and the heterotopias, which is another notion discussed by Michel Foucault. Heterotopias is more like any place can happen to other place kind of a thing. So another way of talking about unreal kind of a space which is created. So that is also another way of reading. So Assorted City is a way of reading the city. It is not really talking about sustainable development goals or things like that. What you need to do after that, then one can see as per the scale of the city and the demands and the studies which to be done. So Assorted City is not a solution, but it is a way of reading. That is what I need to, I should highlight.
Okay, just another my thing, like nowadays we see a lot of discussion on the concept of right to the city. So how far it is important for this assorted city concept, or in a more general term, like if we ensure right to the city by somehow, then will it necessarily lead to the creation of a city which is just in some sense?
Right to the city, one important discussion is done by David Harvey, for example, his recent work, and is very, very fascinating kind of work. And he talks about urban commons in details. So urban commons also is a kind of public space in which people can go and play and things like that, like Maidan and all that in Calcutta, or sea beach in Chennai or in Mumbai. And so the more and more that kind of spaces are created, it accommodates people. So it is no longer a mall as a public space or a club as a public space and things like that. So the public space where anybody can go. I have seen one very interesting space here in Delhi, and I would suggest any of you can go there. And on Sunday morning now, this is a space which used to be a water body historically between in Tughlaqabad area, between the Adilabad fort and Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's tomb. There's a huge space. If you look at the Google Earth also, there's huge open space there. Almost it's a DDS space, no man's land kind of a space, where on Sundays, there are at least 20, 25 cricket teams are playing cricket. Matches are going on in proper leather ball and with all gears. So, and people flying kites, this and that. So those are the kind of urban common spaces which require, where the, there's extension spaces that from the village, the Sangam Bihar also comes and they play, because it's a tight area in which the open spaces are not there. So they come and play in this area. So the more and more public spaces are created in different nature in the city, the better it is. And it is not going to be that kind of a defined gated enclave kind of a thing in which the public spaces are created. Public spaces are created which will be open for everybody. People can use it, and I think that is going to increase the right to the city. And because of the assorted nature, it should be done, because the assorted nature, not only in terms of urban form, it is also kind of people who are staying, and they can accommodate. I mean, they can actually use these public spaces in a much more meaningful manner, and therefore the equity also to some extent is achieved, because these are the spaces which are more equitable, where everybody has a similar stature.
Well, so thank you. Arjun, do you want to make any?
So one question Milon Datta is asking is about, do you recommend urban farming in your proposed landscaping to improve?
I think, sir, Dr. Biswas already answered to this.
Yes, yes, of course, urban farming should be as and when we have the space, and it should be done as much as possible. Urban farming. And in terms of somebody also asked about flooding, urban flooding also, I just mentioned one point. Urban flooding needs to be looked at as more like a landscape solution to urban farming, urban flooding, rather than engineering solutions. So there are discussions of let the water flow, delay the flow, and let the water soak. This is the principle which is to be followed, and through landscape more than through an engineering, the pipe to be laid and the water to be going from one place to the other place without any hindrance. That creates flooding more than the other. And most of this, because of this, the nature in which these negative spaces are created in the interface, and interstitial spaces are mostly negative spaces, and most of them are these water canals and things like that. And I'm getting convinced, because it is happening across board in all the cities. So therefore, I believe that these are the negative spaces being created out of the road, access from the road kind of a plot situation, where the plots are accessed only from the road, and the water channels and the landscape is background, whether it is forest, whether it is canals or whatever. Most of the rivers are also, I've seen that cities are backing the rivers. So because of which many problems come, which is landscape related, like urban flooding and This farming can be also explored in that manner. Flooding also can be looked at. Complete paradigm shift in its the way we look at urban flooding, not by making pipes, but by letting the water flow slowly and getting it soaked into the earth as much as possible, especially in places like Jaipur, Gurgaon, where unimaginable with very little rainfall, the urban flooding happens every this time. Jaipur I saw, Gurgaon also it has happened. Number of times Gurgaon has flooded. So this is, one can understand. In Kochi it is happening with a huge amount of waterfall with groundwater being so high. One can understand. In Gurgaon, Jaipur, one cannot understand at all. So anyway, so these are some of the things which one can consider.
Yes, yes.
So,
Yes, sir. Our city, Soumyadip, sir, also unconscious. But in one of our deliberation, Professor Piyush Tiwari really mentioned, which what sir has also mentioned, that our cities are reluctant urbanization happening in India, because we know everything, we have the knowledge, we have the tools. So, and then there is so much of reluctance, taking this approach, as rightly highlighted by Dr. Biswas. I think, sir, we should we have really,
yes.
we
So
have
thank
worked
you.
really well for quite a long time. Yes, let me
Thank you.
congratulate again. Yes, Soumyadip, you can propose a vote of thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you once again on behalf of the team IMPRI for making us familiar with this very interesting concept of assorted cities. And as you mentioned, from today's discussion, it is quite clear that the Indian cities of the 21st century is indeed a dynamic entity, and the demographic changes in the Indian cities that occur much too fast to be acknowledged in government policies. So it is important to understand how the Indian cities are transformed to certain particular socio-spatial imaginaries and modes of control, regulation, and governance, which are shaped by the interactions among different multiscalar actors and the stakeholders. And understanding these aspects within a range of cities with distinctive processes and socio-spatial political dynamics, I think would undoubtedly enrich the very understanding of complexities and contestations of urban transformation in India cities. So thank you once again for coming to this web policy talk, and when we hope that you will be able to attend some of our future programs, because we will be continuing with this city conversation talks. So we hope to have you in near future as well. So thank you
very much. Thanks for calling me. It was a pleasure.
Have a nice evening, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.